But yeah, it is absolutely wonderful, and we publicly are not announcing it just yet, but there is some steps being made to grow the wolf pack and ultimately cement what that looks like, which is really, really cool. And that will go public tomorrow and into next week. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, it's exciting, man.
Yeah, very, very exciting. So if you're watching this live and don't have a clue what we're talking about, head over to the Edufuturists website very soon or subscribe to the newsletter. You can find out more. There's some cool stuff happening. But we are here in the studio to talk about a very, very important topic. I don't want to say issue, because issue sounds like that's a problem. We want to talk about a really important topic, an area that is important for everybody who is involved in education. And we have gathered together, curated, assembled the Avengers of Send and Inclusion. And we are really, really pleased to be joined by 4 wonderful guests in the studio. Me and Steve will probably, I say we're going to say very little. Never happens, that, does it? So we'll try our best, because these are the people that are doing this work and doing this work really, really importantly. And I've got a great perspective, got loads of questions to get through. But I will say, if you are watching this live and want to drop a question into the chat, please do. We'll share these with our guests as we go. We have got some preset questions to ask them. But if you've got some others that you want to ask, please do drop them into the chat now. Or as we go. Don't have to do it straight away, because you might not think of it until later on as I start speaking. So anyway, that's stop rambling. We're gonna get people to introduce themselves. So we're gonna start up with Patrick, and then we're gonna come down. Patrick, could you tell us a little bit about you and why this area of sending inclusion is important to you?
Perfect. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to be on such a brilliant panel here with everyone. I will remember to talk slowly because Paddy always says that the subtitles may be needed. So I'll remember that. So I'm Patrick Hickey. I'm from Limerick in the Republic of Ireland. I'm a primary school teacher. I like technology to enhance teaching, learning and assessment. My go-to phrase for the different platforms in terms of Google, Canva, Apple, etc. In terms of inclusion, we were joking before we started about my long-running PhD. So I, to be honest, it was a privilege to explore the experiences of teachers with physical disabilities. So it was something that I learned absolutely loads through. I also joke that if anyone wants to know how not to do a PhD, I'm probably the person to talk to. But I really am invested in, and I also need to caveat this because we're not face to face. I have a prosthetic right leg, so I walk with the aid of a crutch. I can walk without it, but my physio gives out to me for it. So I've the important things now I'm going to summarize. I learned that recently. So I'm a primary teacher since 2014, and I'm a big believer in making the visible as invisible as possible in terms of inclusion. Paddy will have a nicer slogan in a few minutes, but I often talk about that, how we can support our learners in the best way possible and making them feel as included as humanly possible as well. So I'll stop at that, Ben, and thanks again.
No, amazing. And Patrick was kind enough to join us as one of our in-person roadshows in Belfast, and talked brilliantly about that, making the visible invisible, and what it was like to have the experience of being in that space, but also how we can address that and support learners at all ages with those physical needs and difficulties, not necessarily difficulties, disabilities, different abilities, however we want to phrase it. And I know that some of that will come up in the conversation today, but thank you for joining us again, Patrick, twice in a roadshow. There aren't many people that have done that, so well done. Next up, we have got Nici, who's obviously a good friend of the Edufuturists. So yeah, tell us a little bit about you, your intro, and what people need to know about you.
Hi guys, so yeah, so lovely to be here with you all, and nice to see Patrick. I haven't seen him in a while, so it's always lovely. It's such a pleasure to be with both Patricks actually. I'm Nici Foote. I've been a teacher for quite a long time. Spent a predominant about 17 years abroad, working on the international teacher circuit. But my experience comes way before that, where I was diagnosed as a student with dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and an auditory processing disorder when I was in my 10 and then in my teens. And so for me, the classroom has always felt very, I would say, a place full of failure. And in fact, what I think about students with needs is often we grow up to be adults who are very, very responsive to failure and very comfortable in that space because it's something that we've had to live through for a long time. So I left the classroom about 4 years ago as a primary school teacher. My favourite space is the early years classroom. So I was head of early years for a while. But now I work with schools and inclusion and a lot, actually most stakeholders. My favorite cohort at the moment is working with parents. And what I really love to do is work with people in order to support them into understanding what inclusion really is. What systems do we have in place already? What do you need to move forward to? What is your vision of inclusion in your community? And how can we get there? Bringing along our community every step of the way together, giving it that sense of trust and belonging, which I think is really a missing piece in the puzzle that we have at the moment.
Thank you. And thank you for your telling your story as well, because I think that context is really important. You run an organisation as well. So the work that you do is as Unbury Me. Is that right?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that's actually my other baby. So I've got 3 children at home. And they're all teenagers now. So I just thought I'd create a new baby, which is Unbury Me, which is probably the wildest beast I've ever created. And it's been 10 years going, not 10 years, sorry, 10 months. I'm in 10 months in, and we're finding our feet, which is really, really nice. But I have to say, it's been quite a lovely ride, but quite uncomfortable for the last few months.
Yeah, I can imagine. And some of that will probably come out in the conversation today as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to joining the wolf pack.
Yes, the wolf pack. Yes, there we go. I don't know why I do that. Like I'm some kind of like rocker. I'm an old rocker if I am, but that's okay. Old rockers work. Next up, we are pleased again, another good friend that many of you will be familiar with, and you'll recognise his dulcet tones. If you're not watching this and you're just listening back, you'll recognise his dulcet tones. It's the other Patrick, but for the sake of not making this confusing, we're going to call this Patrick Paddy. Paddy, just tell us a little bit about you and your background, please.
If my mother were still with us, Ben, she would be phoning you right now and saying it's actually Patrick. but you all know me as Paddy, so we'll stick with that. And it's such a privilege. Like, what a brilliant lineup you've got here. But to actually have 2 Irish Paddies in one webinar is pretty much unheard of. So Patrick, it's brilliant to have 2 Irish voices on this. I'm from the opposite side of the country to Patrick. I am based in Belfast, so a little bit north. And for those of you who don't know me, so Paddy McGrath, I'm head of education, Europe, Middle East, and Africa for a company called Everway. Lots of people know that company as under its previous name of Text Help. We're super fortunate to be the largest accessibility technology company in the world. So right across the world, we do assistive technology. I suppose, why am I here? I am very fortunate that I get to travel to a lot of places and spend time talking to a lot of wonderful people about 2 things. One is inclusion. And my passion driver for that is inclusion means all, not just some. And I'm sure we'll get to that throughout our conversations today. And I think it's really important that we all help define what inclusion looks like and drive it forward. And the second thing I like to talk about an awful lot is barriers, not because I like them, but because I think we all have it in our power as practitioners and educators to remove those barriers. And of course, my lens is thinking about, well, where does technology fit within that? So if we help define inclusion, how do we use technology to kind of leverage some of the help and support there? And of course, SEND is part of that. And I've been fortunate to be involved in a large number of school systems around the globe, see what works, what doesn't work. But if you just give me 2 words today, it's inclusion and barriers. That's my 2 passion drivers in everything I do.
Amazing. And it's really important that you, as those people who've signed up, you'll see that we've called this area SEND and inclusion, not just SEND and not just inclusion, because obviously those 2 things can become interchangeable and they get missed. And sometimes people think that inclusion is just SEND, and sometimes they just think that SEND doesn't include other things that we definitely should do. So that's why we've lumped those things together in a conversation today. And last but not least, from an intro perspective, is a newer friend to us as Edufuturists, somebody who I've known a little bit longer than Steve, but who is doing wonderful work and comes out of, and the reason why she's doing what she's doing The story is wonderful, and I know that it'll come out in why you are literally doing what you do now. He's not just well, this is what I thought I'd do. It was a necessity, wasn't it? So tell us, Kate, tell us a little bit about you and your background, if you could.
Yeah, hello everybody. Ben, honestly, I thought when you introduced Paddy, you were going to do an old rocker joke, but I'm not as familiar with with all of you as maybe I know Ben, Ben and Paddy. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. Nice to do some fun work stuff before the footy. We might talk about that at some point. So I'm Kate. I'm the CEO and founder of Gaia, and most recently the extra part of our organisation called Bloom. All my life, Gaia is a national specialist online alternative provision for children who are neurodivergent and have SEN. We have the privilege of every day supporting, I think we have 68 children at Gaia now who come to us from quite interestingly a lot of different corners of the planet. So we've just welcomed a child from Japan. We have child from Australia, Portugal. I would say I'm in it for the travel, but I spend most of my time at home looking after my team and looking after my two. And then the rest of our children come from the UK. So yeah, Ben, like you said, a real personal connection to this because the needs of my daughter. And I always speak a bit more quietly because she's just got back from their practice. You know, just respect her privacy on that. But there's been many a challenge for Poppy, my youngest, who's now 12. If that means anything to anybody, we're 12. We're cool to do that on YouTube. The teenagers, nearly teenagers amongst us. And she has struggled in school for quite a while. She's dyslexic, PDA profile, and ADHD. And so I am not a teacher. I don't have the patience, capability, gravitas to do such an amazing job. But I have the privilege of supporting a team of teachers as a Gaia and identifying the needs for Pops. And there are millions of kids like her. Well, there's not many. There's just one of her, but there's loads that needs the support that we offer at Gaia. So yeah, Gaia Learning, and then Bloom is our inclusive edtech platform that we use to help schools deliver track and evidence inclusion and support the kids. So yeah, that's my version of exciting little mini clap there. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having me.
So if we move on from the introductions to everybody and we step in and we'll kind of go around in the same order and we start to think about actually in 2026, what does an inclusive education system look like? And also we've probably made some great steps and hopefully we've made some really vast improvements for all. But ultimately, who are we still failing and what is it still failing? So Patrick, if we come to you, or Dr. Patrick, should we come to you first, mate? And what's your, and again, this is opinion and thoughts. This doesn't have to be perfect. What's your thoughts on that?
I think, firstly, Steve, I think you made a great point as well about the positive, because I think sometimes as humans, we're always looking ahead. So like there has been incredible strides taken, particularly as part of the PhD, I looked at policy and like that. I remember one stage I was thinking about, all the things that needed to be changed as well, but it's also, we look back at all the things that's already there, which is important. But secondly, in terms of making, I suppose, a truly inclusive education system, it's number one, it's about as much as we can supporting learners to learn in many different ways. So the day in Belfast, I often use the image of when I was in school, I had a real supportive chair, the blue chairs with the padding and all the rest of it, and I absolutely despised it. Nothing to do with anyone's thought, and those chairs are very, very necessary, but I often use that as an example of that chair kind of made me stand out, and that's why I didn't like it. At the time, I actually didn't know why I didn't like it. It is only in retrospective when you look back. I remember if I moved seats, I was in a small rural school, and if I moved seats, I was always kind of hoping the chair wouldn't come with me. But thankfully, in one sense, maybe for posture, the teacher was always very diligent, and it came with me. But so I think it's important. I just told that story. Just that's the lens that I come to education with, and as much as I can, I try to make the learning as focused on the children's needs as possible. But I'm going to answer your question, Steve, because you're hopefully going to be a good host and jump in. But in terms of who are we failing, or who do we need to provide more support to, I think it's very important that we don't just go with the people that shout the loudest, because sometimes when you look at different groups, it can be a certain group that we don't forget about all the different types of learners within our organizations as well. And the fact that, I suppose, in Ireland at the moment, we're moving away to a certain extent from the assessments. It's based on the school and how they deploy their different special education needs allowance. But it's also very important that it's, you know, that child that maybe not have a diagnosis as well, and how we can use those UDL principles to support them as well. So I'm going to summarize, which is important as well. So number one, I think, because I think usually when people that are tuning into this podcast as well, we're probably speaking a lot to the converted. So loads of great things have happened. You're doing absolutely fabulous things already, but in terms of where we need to go next, just that the UDL principles are really important just for that multiple means of engagement. And in terms of the students, a real bugbear of mine is the fact that if a child is using assistive technology, it might differentiate, for want of a better word, from their peers. So I think it's as much as we can, if a student is using one device in the class, they're the same device as their classmates. And I always approach, anytime I'm talking about UDL, differentiation, inclusive learning, whatever term you would like to use for it, and again, always cognizant of language and what that represents, but we make the child feel the same as everyone else as much as we can. Obviously, I can be critiqued on that by the different types of special educational needs, additional challenges, whichever term again suits best as well. So just that child first approach, and give yourself a bit of credit, because you're after tuning into a podcast and in the month of July, but there's great things happening. There's more things we can do as well. And I'm going to stop at that, because Paddy already told me he wasn't going to get in a word in if I start talking.
Well, that's the end of the podcast, everybody, and it's been a pleasure to everybody else. Well, I'm always joking. I think some great insights there, and I'll, for every person as we go through, I'll repeat the question, and it's ultimately in 2026, what does inclusive education look like or feel like to you, and also who are we still missing or failing, I guess. And Nici, over to you.
I think it's a mind-boggling area actually at the moment, especially in the last month. I think we've seen more come out into the arena of inclusion about the directives, DFE guidelines, looking at the Educational Endowment Foundation, research, things to think about. And we've also got teachers right at the end of the year, boggled already, completely blown. SLT have already planned next year. They know what's going to happen. The funding has already probably been set. And suddenly we've got all of these things coming in that people have to really think about. And I think that can look really messy. December 30th, I think it's December, I can't remember the date of it, because obviously dates are nothing to me, but somewhere in December 2026, we have to have our inclusion strategy mapped out and presentable to Ofsted. Absolutely. Every single school. That's a huge deal. So whilst we're looking at those things and we're reevaluating where that budget's going, plus we've got 400 million coming into the arena in order to support inclusion, we also need to work out where that new budget system's going to go. And I know that a lot of schools that I talk to really struggle with the budget. When I work in Wiltshire with the schools, they're not part of a big trust. Often schools are very standalone or part of a small community, and they don't have those people in there. It's the SLT, it's the head teachers who are department leads who are actually looking at all these kind of tightening pieces that they really need to get their heads around. For me, inclusive education has such hope. One of the good points that I think is really worth mentioning is, for the first time ever, the word belonging is in DFE guidelines and papers. That, for me, is phenomenal. If we could start with that piece alone, I think we've won this year. What I don't want to happen is that we start looking at how we're going to standardise belonging, how we're going to assess belonging, how we're going to collect data on belonging. So I think that really we have a very messy arena. And I think we need to pool our resources together. And I think that it's really important that we start looking and supporting each other. And what does this really look like for every single student, not just our SEND, not just our mainstream SEND, not just our SEND provision or alternative provision. What I want to see is every student in that classroom gets met where they need to be.
Love that. And why? So we're not creating a standardised curriculum for every single person and making and wearing them pointy hats and everything? No, what?
Okay. Is it like we should do pick and mix or something? Pick and mix.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great summary there. Paddy,
no more dunce's hat in the corner.
Yeah, but I'm going to make sure that I don't spend too much time. Paddy, inclusive education 2026. What do you feel like it looks like, or should look like, or feels like, and who we still feeling? Do you think?
Well, I think Nici and Ben actually touched upon it there in different ways, but it clues in the question for me, which is, what does an inclusive education system look like? We're talking about an inclusive education system in 2026. We're not talking about a SEND system, and you kind of split some of those components down, Nici, in your answer. And I think that's what's fundamentally shifted. It's like the mental health conversations that a lot of us will now have that a number of years ago we wouldn't have talked about it in that way. Now we're having conversations about what does inclusion look like. And I think that in and of itself is a really, really important shift and a recognition that all means all and not a subset of learners. So I think that's good and that's exciting. I think in terms of the shifts that we've seen, I do think we're seeing a conscious shift from and this would have been SEND terms in the past, from accommodations to design. And Patrick talked about universal design for learning, and we see that sort of more and more coming to the fore in conversations. How do I approach learning design in a way that includes more students? How do I intentionally remove barriers? And I think that's there, and that shift is happening. And I hear less phrases around accommodations, except for maybe around exams times. And Patrick also said about sort of the technology thing. Technology can give a stigma. If you know, we're well known for text to speech as an example. If I give two students text to speech because they happen to have a dyslexia diagnosis, then everybody else looks different in that classroom and vice versa. So there's stigma. In terms of who is it feeling, I think before I get to that part, I think it's important to note that the shift in inclusion is definitely not systemic, and it needs to be. And if you can go into a school or a multi-academy trust or a college, and you can find, as you can everywhere, excellent practitioners that are practicing inclusive behaviors and actions in their classroom, I don't think there's enough happening there at a systemic level when a school or a trust starts to go, we are an inclusive trust, we are an inclusive school, that we're actually doing it at a full system level. So I think there's some great practice out there. And then in terms of the last part, who's it still feeling? I think even though we're talking about inclusion, we're still swapping it around with SEND. In other words, we're putting children in boxes. You know, we're saying, well, this is how we help a pupil with dyslexia. This is how we help a pupil with a physical need. This is how we help. So there's still a temptation to go down to boxes. And I think that's something that we need to move away from. And that, Nici, to your point, talking about EF and the universal layer that is now very clear through all that documentation, I think really gives me a lot of hope towards the fact that schools do have to have this universal layer. And it's not the be all and end all, it's not the final stages, but it's a great start in 2026 for us to get on that bus and actually have a universal standardized layer of inclusive support in evidence in our classrooms. So I think there's a lot of hope there, and the conversation shifted for sure.
And Kate, just to repeat, inclusive education in 2026, in your opinion and the work that you're doing, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And are we missing anything or anybody and failing anybody?
Yeah, so I won't take it from the white paper. I agree with everything that Nici and Paddy have just talked about, the white paper angle and all of those elements. I'll instead just tell you a quick story. So last year, Poppy was really struggling in school. She one evening rewrote a few chapters or so, episodes or whatever, of Shrek. No Shrek? We all know Shrek, yeah. And she rewrote it as if Princess Fiona had dyslexia and ADHD and therefore was in school but didn't understand the social norms. Yeah, Nici, you should have seen my face when I got this message. She was at her dad's and this chapters and verse came. Poppy and I, this came about because Poppy, she's probably gonna hear me, flipped a table in the dinner hall at primary school and shouted some stuff, and I couldn't cope. And she couldn't cope. The natural default setting is then to take Poppy to one side, all right? To take her to her therapist, take her and go and do that. Actually, what Poppy and I did, and I'm so proud of her, is turned it into a workshop, and we delivered fast track a few months in around December last year. We delivered a 3-hour workshop, or I did it, to 30 primary school kids. And that workshop was called The Princess Ogre in the Brain, and it was about helping children have the language around behaviours, traits, and actions. Because one thing Poppy found really hard is, why aren't the school helping me understand my own brain and create a narrative I can use with my friends to explain, justify, whatever, her thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. And so we created this workshop and delivered for free, just delivered it. And by the way, if anybody ever wants me to do it, it brings me so much joy that I will happily do it. I would rather do that all day, every day. With this workshop, what I didn't know is that there were about 8 children who were recently going through or had just had a diagnosis. And one of them was the exec head's son. I saw this exec head at an event 2 weeks ago, and he told me that the WhatsApp group they have for year 6 was, for the following 2 weeks after my session, all about behaviours, neurodevelopmental, understanding your brain, thoughts, feeling, emotions, and create a language in the group about acknowledgement. So it's so interesting making the visible invisible. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that before. What we did with the group was talk about all the things. And so when we talk about inclusion and SEND and who we're failing, our narrative on is helping the kids understand how they learn, how each other learns, and the different ways to do it, and where there are gaps in curriculum, in training in schools, teachers who have the absolute best intent, but the on the ground grassroots, how you help that child who is flipping the table in the lunch queue and not take her away to her therapist to have that conversation. Maybe you do that and help the children learn from each other and understand. And that's sort of our ethos. And we're going back to do the other year 6 class, probably a year when we did it. So that's what brings me joy, and both very grassroots acknowledges, I think, some gaps, let's put it that way.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think what we'll find, and I'm going to also talk, I know we don't talk about lived experience as a phrase anymore, but I'm going to talk from my own personal experience. It doesn't mean that it's right or better than anybody else's. My own personal experience as a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD, which was a bit strange because I don't talk about the autism stuff very often, but the ADHD stuff's really obvious, and realised that when my mum, who's a Senko, some of you have heard this story loads of times. Sorry, Paddy, you probably heard it 3 times last week. My mum, who's a Senko, has been a SEN coordinator in primary schools for decades, and my brother, who's got complex learning needs, I didn't get a diagnosis. And mum, just when I asked my mum, she just said, "I just thought you were a boy." That was her exact phrase. "I just thought you were a boy." And then in the same way, we're just in the process now of my eldest, who's had some difficulties from an emotional perspective, has just had a test at school in year 10, and I said, and literally the word from the Senko then said, he cannot believe that she has functioned in education up until this point. It's not just about spelling. He said that the dyslexia that is in her space right now, in her world, and we're like, what? We just thought she struggled with like B's and D's, and I didn't know. And that is happening right now in our world right now. And I'm thinking to myself, the whole, especially, and it brings me into the next question, really, this idea of we often think that inclusion or work around SEND, and this ties builds on what you said, Paddy, is about certain groups of people, or it's for those people who go to that inclusion base, or those people that have got an EHCP, or those people that have got a diagnosed condition, and that those words like condition, disorder, like, oh come on, that deficit model, like, I know that'll come out in today. It just feels like an inclusion system, an education system that is inclusive in 2026 is has got to genuinely think about that. And I think, and I don't know if anybody wants to jump in rather than rather than ask the question of to everybody, but that certain learners, sometimes inclusion and inclusive classrooms are about thought about as certain learners. If you've got an identified need, you've got an EHCP or whatever else, rather than a principle that shapes everything. And I think that builds on some of the stuff that we've been talking about in UDL, Universal Design for Learning. Does anybody want to jump in about that thought?
I think that actually sometimes I reflect back and I think, yes, it's an education system, but I also think it's a bias system. I think we are very ableist in our thinking. For instance, on LinkedIn, I see many educators, teachers for years posting, I'm no longer going to read a post if it has emojis in it, because that means that AI has written it and someone hasn't bothered to write their own LinkedIn posts. And now I've seen this numerous times from someone that I have followed and I have worked with for years. And I think that mindset of challenging, of looking at someone's writing and saying an emoji means that they have used AI, I think really shows that ableist lens that people look on. And I'm with you. That word of disability is really difficult, but I'm also so used to using it. And I also feel that it's part of my own sense of what's that bit, identity, that I want to get rid of it, but I don't know what to replace it with, but I think, bias for me is really important. When we look at our teachers, what are we seeing in our classrooms that we've been seeing for years? And I think about those teachers when we pass the classroom notes at the end of the year to the next teacher. This is your list of students and this is what they're like. And you talk about that behavior and you say, Johnny can't sit next to, Gertrude or whatever it is. Sorry about the names there. But you're like, those two children can't sit next to it. These two children always fight at play. You're putting such a lens on you, on how you feel about those students. Often there's words like can be a little bit lazy, for instance. Now, how many adults do we have now who have been classically lazy their whole life, turns out to be late diagnosed ADHD females, And I think that it's the language that we place around all of this. We need to look at how we see people and what behavior we need to get uncovered to find out exactly what's going on underneath.
I think, but although, can I jump in there, Ben? Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
There's a couple of wee things on that. I think one of the things that is challenging about the conversations that I've heard so far, and I hope none of you mind me saying this, is that we are talking about inclusion, but yet we have instinctively defaulted to dyslexia and ADHD. And actually, when we talk about inclusion, we do need to think about color and creed and background and economics and mental health. And we need to think about all of those things. We need to think about representation. It's not those individual needs, for want of a better phrase, for the person of today, or diagnosed needs, are a fundamental part of what we should be doing. And I also think, we have to be very careful when we talk about inclusion, that we're not actually diluting the fact that some students do need very specific supports and they need to be out of school or in an intervention room. We have to recognize that. And again, Ben, I've heard you speak loads of times. You've heard me speak loads of times. I talk a lot about icebergs. And I think an iceberg is a very important analogy, which is we end up sometimes defaulting to the conversation on inclusion of the children at the top of the iceberg, the visible piece that you talked about, Kate, looking at these children who we know need specific support, who very clearly are identifiably in need of support from us. But sometimes we neglect that sort of under the waterline, which could be, and like to your point, Nici, where we do the handover piece and we go, well, this person, we don't know what's going on at home. We don't know about mental health struggles or money or school refusers, or we don't know what mom and dad have fed them. We don't know about hunger. We don't know about all of these areas of what's going on in their lives, and we never will. And when we talk about removing barriers. It's a real struggle to go as a practitioner, well, let's just identify all the barriers. Let's put a kid in a box and figure out how we correct that. We can't actually do that. But again, my point, I suppose, Ben, sorry, I'll use Patrick's piece here, which is to summarize, is if we're talking about inclusion, we have to make sure we're talking about every aspect of that. And I know that's hard and very wide, but we do have to do that. There's so many variants here. Every one of us is different on this call. And so too is everyone in every classroom that we've ever been in.
Mm.
And I suppose that it's a really interesting one, because if we were to get 6 other people on the call to discuss it, the conversation and the uniqueness of actually varying as opinions, lived experiences and everything else is very varied. And I think that's the bit of don't standardise anything, because every individual school, even in a multi-academy trust, will be so different and diverse. The last thing we want to do is take something that is standardised, go, that's not working, and then standardise it in a different way. But I suppose if maybe we'll go to Patrick and Kate in regards to, what is the biggest barrier to inclusion then, and the steps that we need to talk? Is it the culture? Is it and society? Is it curriculum? Is it accountability? Is it funding? Is it all of those, or is there anything that actually is the biggest barrier to have an inclusive education system for all? Don't know if anybody wants to jump in. I've named Kate and Patrick, but Kate, do you want to go?
Yeah, please. So to Paddy's point is absolutely spot on, and one of the things that we can pride ourselves on, I guess, at Gaia and using the Bloom platform is it's completely judgment free, and it's about visibility of the whole child that takes into account the emotional, the well-being, and the academic, and the journeys across all of those things. And I think, to your point, Steve, there are lots of barriers or enablers, depends of which ways you look at them. If we look at them as enablers, you can levers that can help move things forward, and it's partly, but for us, it's about insight. How do you understand? How do you get that whole child view, that picture that includes all of those variables that Paddy's talked about? The acknowledgement that there are multiple stakeholders. If a child has needs, often multiple stakeholders supporting that child. There are often always multiple circumstances affecting all of the children, to your point, Paddy, about hunger and homelessness. And, before any child comes to Gaia, the context of that they're with grandma and dad's in prison, and, they've been out of 3 different schools. They've been in 4, SEN or AP provisions. And so that context plays a much more significant role before you get to, and they have this need. That need, the ability to support the child in that need, whatever that need is, diagnosis, condition, trait, background, history, economic standing, whatever it is, depends on being able to see the whole picture. And then using that to make informed decisions that are aligned to the values of the multi-academy trust, the school. Nici, you mentioned parents. We do a lot of work with parents. So we need to have a conversation. The understanding of that broader picture, because every child goes to school or doesn't, and lives in the context like we all do adults, all the things we bring to work every day. And the more you can see that, and that's the starting point to then look at how we best support that child, whether they're in the classroom, sat in the corridor, outside the classroom, rightly or wrongly, what is the information we have to support them? And I think that's one of the powerful levers that we need to look at as an ecosystem. How do we, it's called an EHCP. It's Education, Health and Care Plan. There are social services, there are all those parties, and it's sort of macroeconomic piece. And part of what we're doing at Bloom is putting a tech infrastructure around enabling that insight, so that those parties supporting those children, whether it's SDN or not, have that picture of that whole child. So that's, the answer is probably all of them, all of those things, Steve. And it starts with what is our understanding and what do we know?
Yeah, I think what was really interesting is maybe time and space. That the time and space for in an education system where actually curriculum and learning is so intensive and full, actually we don't create space to actually get to understand the uniqueness of every learner, starting points, and actually build trust with them. But that was just my interpretation of kind of what you said there, Kate. I think it's really difficult when you've got a class of 30 or more. But ultimately, it has been done and can be done. And it's interesting. But Patrick, any thoughts on in terms of any particular barrier from your sites and work that you're doing?
I'm actually going to zone in on culture for a second. I'm going to just link back to what Kate, Paddy and Nici said. First of all, I really like that Shrek, the rewriting Shrek, because I think the word disability is viewed negatively in society. As part of the research, I interviewed 7 people. The first question I asked was, what think of the word the words physical disability? 2 out of the 7 absolutely despised the word disability. 1 person preferred the word condition, and the other person hated the word disability, but like what Nici said, he hadn't necessarily a better word for it. But when I had the opportunity to dig deeper into over the course of the research, and when I asked him about why that disability, why was it was whatever way you look at it, it was seen as it was a negative within society. So I suppose that's important, we'll say, of how difference. And I suppose in my previous answer, I generally often use 2 or 3 different words to describe the same thing, because we're not sure of how those words land with a certain person, what words are best. But I also just want to touch on what Paddy said about when we talk about SEND and inclusion, we by default we think about the dyslexia and the dyspraxia, those, and again, I'm not in any way saying that is incorrect, but I think it is that broad inclusion, the race, gender, etc. Is incredibly important, and we don't just see it in one sense. And the final thing I'm just going to say, the culture was in my research, I looked at disability through the social model, and in fairness, I was rightly questioned on that a few weeks ago. If we automatically say I suppose the barriers are in society as well, we can sometimes fail to recognize the amount of effort and the amount of additional time and just that tiredness that often comes with navigating a world that's not built for you. Whether that's our students, we'll say, accessing the curriculum, or whether it's a person with a physical disability that they can't access the local theatre, or they have to book a specific bus as well. So it's important we don't dilute that additional energy that's required just to navigate things. I'm using inverted commas. Some things that can be regarded as normal experiences as well, because sometimes I often joke that I sometimes get a round of applause for doing something very menial, a task that everyone else takes for granted as well. And when I was younger, that just really annoyed me. But I think it's important that we don't, and it got me to consider that as well. We don't unrecognize that the amount of effort. Myself and Nick did a job in January, and there was an incredible woman with us, and she was a woman with a visual impairment, and I was most empathetic. I've been in years how she navigated airports and all the rest of it, and I was really inspired, we'll say. And I was in 2 minds. I really wanted to just tell her this, but then I was thinking, is that the ableist lens that we've been accustomed to? The world isn't set up, we'll say, for people with physical disability. So it's that culture piece. I think it's important, and often I think about certain things or why I react in a certain way. But I think it's good that number one, we don't zone automatically into the top of the iceberg, like what Paddy said. I really like what Kate said about representation. You have to see it. So it's important that we can see teachers. We can see teachers with the physical disability. We can see teachers with dyslexia. We can see all these people in society. We can see different genders in Ireland. Often the male representation at primary level is underrepresented as well, but just that we brought that and we don't automatically go to the top of the iceberg.
I love that.
Can I throw one word in there, Ben?
Yeah.
Just one of the, and like, I can't add anything to what the other 3 guests said because they've been amazing answers. But one of the things that I would say in there that is a word that Stevie didn't mention in the question is responsibility. I think for too long, with the responsibility of inclusion, and I use that in inverted commas, like Patrick said there, has been the SEND or the Senko specialist, the director of inclusion piece. And I think that conversation is thankfully shifting, and that's part of the culture piece, Patrick, that you said there. Like we've got to change that narrative in England in particular, and to some extent in the Republic of Ireland, Patrick. There's been a kind of a move away from this specialist support is with the local authorities, and that's for one particular student. And I think thankfully now, certainly in England, I can see it happening in Ireland, we're moving that back and bringing it more into the schools, which I think then becomes everybody's responsibility. And I think that's a really important piece, because for too long we were given an out to go, well, that is the Senko's responsibility. They can sort that piece out. And I think now we're moving away from that, which is good. So I think that's a barrier, but it's shifting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose one of the things we wanted to tip into today was about whose responsibility is this, and a little bit like safeguarding, and the pat answer is when you get asked the question, whose responsibility is safeguarding, and we all go, everyone's, and not just point to the DSL, like in the same way, like whose responsibility is inclusion? Oh no, it's not just the Senkos. Like, you're absolutely right, it is everybody's. I think, interestingly, though, from a UK perspective, and I know there'll be people watching this and listening to this outside of the UK system or space, there are challenges here in terms of the move from having lots of specialist provision to now trying to create a universal offer, which is a really powerful and a real positive for inclusion. So it means that we are not just thinking about, right, well, we'll put those people with needs over there in that building, and we'll make sure that everybody else, the typicals, the normies, or whatever we call them, they will be over here. They're horrible. And language is really important. And I don't think we haven't necessarily put that as a question, but I think all of us on the call, on the webinar, have used a phrase and gone, the language is wrong, the language is wrong, the language is wrong. But as I agree with what Paddy just said, we are moving in the right direction, because we've gone from having lots of words that are labels, and we're now moving into trying to think about, how do we do this for everybody? How do we create this lab for everybody? And I think this is the longest I've gone in a conversation with Paddy without him using his slogan. But I think many people will know that Paddy uses this, and other people have tried to rip it off and say it badly. But Paddy has nailed this, not just in the work that he's doing with Everway, but also in how he supported other people. And he talks about that some of the technology that we'll talk about, and I know some of that will come in with the personalization in a moment, is necessary for some and useful for all. And I said it right the first time.
Hold on.
And I think sometimes I get it the wrong way around because my brain works a bit funny. But this idea of necessary for some, useful for all, like, that is where we're getting to a point. It's not just the technology that either. It's about all sorts of things that we do. How do we create an inclusive education system, inclusive society? Because I think it becomes more than just education, doesn't it? So one thing that is worth talking about, and I know I'm going to come to you if I can first, Kate, because I know that you work and your organisation is an online alternative provision initially. So it's one way to describe it. It's not the only way to describe it, I know. And we have done a webinar number 5 was about alternative provision. And one of the things that came out of that was about exclusion and about removing people. And actually, if we look at our exclusion system and those people who are PX'd, and then correlate that against those with additional needs, special needs, whatever phrase we want to use, that number is startling. And somebody probably has that research somewhere more likely than I have. But Kate, I wonder, sometimes attendance, behaviour, well-being, it's becoming increasingly complex in the world that we're in. And so that how do we then make sure that we don't just respond with systems that exclude, and that we move into something that's a supportive classroom system leadership? If I can come to you first, yeah. Kate, but then anybody else, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's really important to meet the child where they are, and to understand. We talked about insight, to understand who that child is and their experiences, their context, diagnosis or otherwise, but to understand them. And as part of that, if we actually do that, we look and go, okay, the ambition, the current ambition that is around inclusion and the mainstream school being able to deliver to support all of those children, that won't fit for all of the children at the time. When you actually look at the child, it won't. It can have the ambition. We agree with the ambition. If you then match that with what our ambition is, and it is, you mentioned, Ben, before about not necessarily talking about lived experience. So I can only talk about the founding reasons as to why Gaia exists. I want Poppy to be with her friends, feeling emotionally safe in a community where she is learning, be that through formal education or otherwise. And that is our ethos at Gaia. We want these children to feel emotionally safe and seen, and in a place that they can learn the best they can learn. If that also happens to align with DfE's policy around inclusion in mainstream classrooms, then absolutely what a win that is. But our focus, and we have the privilege of doing this as part of a specialist AP, is on meeting the child where they are and having that exclusive focus on what works for them, with breadth of understanding of who that child is in the context of wanting them to be in part of the school. And so it is naive if you don't look at that child and look at who they are and understand that context, and just go with a broad brush approach of we want them to be in school. Part of the conversations at the Whole Ed conference the other week was about the lack of insight, the lack of understanding of when that child is not in the classroom. What I do not want for any child is for when they're not in school, for them to be disconnected. But being connected to the education ecosystem with their friends is not the same as being physically in the classroom. And I thought, and that's just, a thing a few of us have mentioned about complexity and intricacies and insight and understanding. And you need to have, and we have this at Gaia and with the product Bloom, a much more fluid and holistic look at that child's learning journey and their education. And often our first question from parents is born from insecurity, and it's about attendance. What do you do about attendance? Is my child, who is currently in autistic burnout, who has not gone to school for the past 3 months, going to get an absolute in for not being in school? No, they're not. We will take that brunt. We will educate, because the schools that come to us understand our ethos, understand where we fit. So I think there's a meet the child where they are in that holistic sense, and it really is seeking to understand the whole. And let's be honest, if that child, as much as a DfE and everybody will completely acknowledge the importance of attendance in school and the impact that has on the micro and macro economy and that child's future, I get that. When you have a child who is not able to be in that classroom, lots of reasons for taking the time to look at that child, telling them they need to be in the classroom is going to make it worse. And so it comes from looking, and it's back to our ethos is learner first, and we want the child to be emotionally safe and seen and learning. Would love them to be back in school. That's what I want, if that is the place where they are emotionally safe and seen and learning. And so I think that then when we talk about tech and we talk about AI and personalization, it has to sit in the context of that perspective and that value set. And I think too often, look at the linear approach to education, to attendance, and then attainment, and then Nici, to your point about belonging, how beautiful is that? But it has to come from the value set and understand that whole child, and that is a generational shift. I know we're talking about what happens in the future. It is a generational shift. COVID has formed a role in that, and parents and our world being able to personalize all the different things we have in our life, our homes, our fitness, our nutrition. We can personalize all of that. And to your point about pick and mix, it is a generational shift that is going to take, but it is born from believing that it's important to see the context that child sits within and see the whole child. And that is my little preachy approach that I appreciate I've just gone off on.
Well, I've got something to add to that, because I think if you look at this, the DfE data, so 187% severe absent is 187% higher than in pre-pandemic years. So when we're measuring it, we have a generational problem. And I'm going to say, Kate's told a story, I'll tell one too. My daughter didn't attend school for 4 years at all. Pretty much, she had 15% attendance. She's 19 now. And I know she won't mind me telling this story, because she's very proud of herself, and so am I. But getting there, it nearly broke us. We had to report to social services. We were on the CAMHS waiting list for 3 years before we got even the first appointment. And when we got that first appointment, we got 6 appointments and then nothing else. In order to meet those students' needs, there's a lot of stigma about why they aren't attending. And then the shame that goes with being a parent of a school refuser is horrific. And it really does take a very strong, and I always say 2-parent family who are doing very well and have shit sorted in order to turn up and sort that problem out. And I'm going to say most of us crumble at that hurdle because it's very, very hard. So yeah, I think that, I mean, knowing Molly now, she's amazing. She's got a job. She can totally talk the hind legs off a donkey about her challenges and about her future and about what she wants in her future, and has amazing passion for social activism. So I have no problem with where she's going, but the journey to get here was very, very difficult.
But is that, Nici, in your experience in that, is that part of the challenge that we, the system, not we as parents or as educators, the system has always went, there's a behavior problem, therefore we must fix it. There's a well-being problem.
Yeah.
So it's fix the problem, when in actual fact, those aren't problems. Those are just symptoms of whatever's underlying.
Absolutely. It's the symptoms. Molly now is on the waiting list to get an autistic ADHD diagnosis, which she's, being pushed forward for. But we've got an 8-year waiting list on that because she's now an adult. Do you know what I mean? So it's really messy. That behavior underneath it, if we looked at that behavior, you could have seen some of this behavior when we talked, when her teacher, when Molly was in, year 1, she would have seen some of that behavior then.
I think for me, that's the whole part on the focus on design as well. Whilst it won't help every child or every student or every pupil, I think attempting to remove as many barriers before they become crises as possible can aid our approach to understanding the underlying piece there, for sure. That's certainly be my view on it.
I think what's really interesting is for everybody that knows me, I have 2 young children. Ella turned 6 last week. Ella doesn't have any diagnosed need or anything else, as far as we're aware, but that is not much of a difference. Ella is not a massive fan of school at 6-year-old, which is really interesting. But I think that's maybe for many. And also, I think those younger people come from a different generation where actually they're a little bit more rebellious and they're used to saying no. And has society and the younger generation and the education system that has literally was probably not right for us that are on the call, that are in our 40s or in our 50s and everything else, that we just kind of went through that system because our parents said, well, that's just what you do. Where the young generation are used to streaming service and getting things in a very different way and consuming information, but also being quite vocal about things that they don't like and how they want things to change. And actually, is that with AI coming in, does that create greater positives and opportunities for our younger generation that are more willing to vocalize their frustration, rightly or wrongly, and say, you know what, that doesn't suit my need as an individual? Because ultimately, Ella just does not understand how school cannot be Netflix. She does not understand it, I'll tell you now. She doesn't. And ultimately, we are analog. We are teaching in an analog world to streaming kids. And we're still going, yeah, but look what it used to be like. Let's give them books. They maybe don't want a book. And ultimately, if we talk about SEND and particular need, Ella doesn't have one, but she definitely doesn't want the system that's currently there. And how do we make it more inclusive for everybody? Even Ella's at age 6 wants something faster, wants something different. She wants to absorb and skip. And if she wants PE on a Tuesday, she wants PE on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, even in those different variations. And she wants to make a different decision when she walks in on a Tuesday that is only available on a Thursday. And she's going, oh, no, absolutely not, Daddy. Literally, I'm just thinking, and I will lead with a question. We got Kate, you beat me to it. We almost made a full hour without mentioning AI. This is the first tech webinar anybody will have watched in the last 4 years that hasn't mentioned AI in the first 5 minutes. But does that give us one of the most influential, positive opportunities, or could that create greater barriers? and maybe we lead it with that education or some of the stuff that I've just talked about in terms of Ella. I always lead it back to my children because I just think I see rebellious, especially in females. Like Ella now is like, absolutely not, Dad, I'm not having it. So what is our thoughts?
Steve? I think it's both, because on your first part, kids are saying no more. Absolutely. And why? Because we're empowering them, I hope, with more choice and more voice going forward. And we should be doing more of that. And I think if you think about that choice and voice, and for me, education is a lot about confidence, is providing children with confidence in whatever that means to the individual. And if we do that and they have a better voice and a more representative voice, I think that helps us as educators, because to your point, if we focus very much on goals, right, we can, for example, we can set high expectations on goals, but we can have goals that are common towards a wide body, including Ella, including my daughter Cara, including all of our children here. We can have that, but we can offer alternative pathways that they can have a choice and voice on. We can help remove barriers and offer pathways. And I think to your question, AI is a game changer in that, because AI does potentially, if used carefully, give us the genuine opportunity for one-to-one learning, because actually a truly expressive, self-paced, Socratic focused, independent path to learning to still reach the same goal that everybody is expected to achieve or to aim for in that class, but on a completely unique pathway that suits your daughter, my daughter, all of our daughters and sons choices and their voice. So I think AI does it, but at the same time, again, coming back to your question, Steve, I think the biggest challenge I have, and Ben would have heard me mention this last week, is is if you go to a single town in the UK as a whole, in the Republic of Ireland, and in any country, and you have two schools side by side, one that is embracing AI and one that is not embracing AI well, you automatically create a massive part of inequity between those two schools. And I think that's our bigger challenge with AI. Not does it give ultimately loads of pathways, support for personalized learning, individual targeted intervention, all those wonderful accessibility things as well. But we have a potential that if we don't provide balance through the entire school system with AI, that actually we start to reinforce inequity throughout a lot of those bodies. So I think there's, as always with AI, there's upsides and downsides, and that's the two for me.
Anyone else got any thoughts on that particularly?
I worry a little bit about the AI piece because I think we haven't quite found our stride in the last 15 years when EdTech started to come in to our schools in a one-to-one or shared device system. And I think when you look at the problems that we had at the beginning, we had a lot of people who were embracing it, getting involved in it, wanting to try it. We had a real innovative culture in pockets. I would think if I had predicted that we would be much further along by now. But what we have is a lot of conflict around what technology looks like, screen time, how much it should be in our students' life. And so that's really nice. I'm reading that. Anyway, so I think one of the things that I think is also, it's moving really fast. AI is moving faster than any of us would ever have predicted. If I look at the tools I'm using now, they were changed a couple of months ago. And I'm a massive fan. I use it every day to keep my menopausal brain alert and alive and remind it that it still has existence. But 1 in 4 teachers last year only had under a day of formal professional learning. And that's not even with EdTech. And I think that if we're going to use AI, I'm really worried about the inequalities. I'm worried about so many of our 44% of our students in primary school don't even have access to devices at home or have internet access. That is also a huge problem. And I think that we really need to be very clear on what that looks like for our students and for our teachers in that learning piece. And one thing I'd say, which Paddy and I have talked about actually quite a lot, is that when we do have these amazing tools, because we know all of us on the call have seen how incredible they are at changing the life of a student in learning and how they see themselves. For me, it's always about how they see their own stories, how they hear themselves think and learn, and how they can change their confidence with the tools. That for me is powerful. But the tools, there's so many of them, and they are very dominant, and the AI kind of price tag that goes on it, I think, has to be really carefully looked at, because I think that that is really, really another inequality piece for our schools.
Yeah, I totally agree. And technology, from whether that is a platform in and of itself that's supporting that inclusive space, or whether that is a tool that has inclusion and accessibility and AT and AI elements sat into that mix. We all have seen and experienced tools that work really well for personalization and adaptation. But if that isn't available, as we've all said on this space, it can either widen that gap or it can close that gap. It can be the great equalizer, or it can be the great, as I think the phrase Paddy used last time was great de-equalizer. I don't know if that's a word, but I'll take what Paddy said. He used the word de-equalizer. It probably is a word. And I think what we've all aware of here is that there's lots of things that we are doing, and there's still lots of other things to be doing. I think I want to jump into this because I know that you mentioned it, Nici, about belonging, and about the first time ever it feels like the white papers and others are talking about belonging. And I don't know if there's anybody particular that wants to jump here, but if we judged is an interesting word as well, but we're in a space where we've got judgment and observation and whatever else. But if we made decisions about how well schools and colleges were doing in terms of how well every learner felt like they belonged and thrived in that space, rather than just what score they got, how much attendance they had, and all the other bits that went. What do you think? How different could it look if we focused on belonging and thriving as opposed to just attainment and attendance? Anybody? Go on, Kate.
I'll jump in. So I absolutely know with my whole heart and professional mind that if we focused on the sense of emotional safety and belonging, the consequences of that would be higher grades or better attendance, better attainment, interdisciplinary learning. The consequences of that are so powerful. The humans that we aspire to help our children at Gaia become more happy, healthy, kind humans that have a sense of emotional safety and security and a sense of self, and can create argument and discussion, and hold their own when they are mute and they haven't spoken and look on their parents' knee, engage. So I know with an arrogance that I'm happy to carry, that if we're to focus on and put the groundwork in the understanding of ensuring those children, young adults, are emotionally safe and seen, and feel a part of something, and we truly look at it through that holistic lens, the impact on the individual, the family, the school, the economy would be 10 times over if we put all our eggs in the attendance basket.
Yeah, I worked with a student in Wales recently, and his parents and aunt, uncle, asked me to attend a meeting, a review meeting, and now their home language is Welsh. The medium at school is in English, and this is a 21-year-old student who can't read, hasn't got any basic numeracy. And I know the parents will be happy with me just to talk about the story a little bit, but just to say that when we went into that meeting, the school, all three teachers in the meeting couldn't say his name. They were saying it completely wrong because it's Welsh. And so I asked him, how do you say your name? Just as a kind of like a vulnerability piece. Let's open it up to the table. This is how we say it in Welsh. And then they consistently through the meeting went on to say the same name again and again in the wrong way. And I think it's like that's one small story, but it's like when we have that piece of belonging, is that you need these students to feel like they are part of you. They are part of the space that we are creating for them. And and that inequality piece, understanding who our students really are and what their culture is and where they come from, that's really important.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
Is it
Paddy,
okay?
Patrick, yeah, jump in, yeah.
I was just going to, I suppose, exactly what Nici said, but I think it ties back to what Kate said previously about meet the children where they are, you know, that belonging piece, because, and that's why, you know, both Paddy, Nici and Kate have mentioned about there's loads of different AI tools, but I think the power of that belonging as well, I often give the example about either students that wasn't a fan of reading, but really liked horses. And because of artificial intelligence, we can create loads of different passages based on what the child is interested in, and that enthusiasm comes for that. And it goes back to Steve's comparison between school and Netflix as well. If we can make the materials more relatable, what the interests of the children are, I think it's really, really important. I think that's the value of AI. But I also think we also need to think about when we use AI tools, and it goes back to the belong as well. What do we want to get from them? You know, are we just using them for the sake of them? And then I'm going to ask a really tough question as well, which brings into belonging. I'll try to answer, but it's going to be tricky as well. But what do we want actually to get from education? You know, because of the different parts being mentioned about, if we were focusing on belonging there, like, are we creating students that we want, you know, to work specific jobs, but those jobs are changing as well. So I think it's important that we reflect on education as a whole and what we get from those different those opportunities as well. I know we won't be able to, I don't think we'll be able to, you know, find maybe solutions to that, but I think it's always important when we do specific skills now, because things are changing as well. And what's the purpose of that? Is it the socio-emotional skills, those softer skills, you know, the communication, the empathy, and all those 21st century skills that are now, it's 26 years into the 21st century skills as well, but, you know, why we're doing specific things in education as well. And perhaps we don't have the autonomy to change, but just that we're reflecting on the why and the how of those tools as well. I always quote Darren White, which is it starts with the why. His book there a number of years ago as well. So that why of education.
I think that's the purpose of education. I think I'm just trying to think how many years ago we had Valerie Hannon on, and that was a thing of, like, literally, even on this call, if we were to ask individually and say, write down before we came to this call, what is the purpose of education, we probably would have different opinions. You cascade that across and ripple that out across. I think really what is the purpose and role of education? Some would say childcare. There's so much variation and nuance in people's opinion in society of that, which brings challenges of, are we trying to flourish? Are we trying to provide a workforce of tomorrow? What is it? And I think that's the challenge. How do we don't know what the end point is and what our ambition is often. So how do we know to get there? How can you set milestones and develop it if you don't know where the end point is and the target of where we're trying to get to? And I think that leads into, if we were to consider, you know, like, assumptions. We talked about assumptions. We've talked about SEND always been linked to inclusion. But ultimately, what is one assumption individually, I guess, and we'll go around, that education still needs to let go of? And Paddy, I'll probably start with you, and then Nici, Kate, and then Patrick, in regards to one assumption that we still haven't got over yet for whatever reason.
I think, Steve, it comes back to where we started in the conversation for me, and so it's going to be a short answer, which is, I think there's two assumptions, one of which is that inclusion is SEND, and it's a specific set of learners, and I think we need to work much harder to go that. Again, like I said at the outset, I think we're getting there slowly, but we need to move beyond that, and that inclusion should be wider. And two, I mentioned it earlier, which was that the responsibility falls to everyone to embrace this and move it forward. And I think if we were just to take those two things and focus on those two things, I think we'd all collectively move the needle a very, very, very long way in a quick period of time. But change is slow, culture is slow. But I think those are the two assumptions that we need to really work on really hard.
Nici?
Mine is inclusion. Is the SEND team's job, I would say, and also that inclusion is SEND. I think those two need to go. Inclusion is everybody. It's not just disability or ability. If I could get, that's really lovely. Inclusion is what we do. Belonging is how it feels. I love belonging. For me is everything. It's creating that space, like Paddy said, that we can move everyone together. Everyone can feel like they can live in a space that they can thrive. And that's, for me, where I want our students to get to. When I think about what is education, it's so that they can thrive in the big wide world and be who they need to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go Ben.
No, Kate, jump in. Yeah, if you've got a thought there, jump in there. It's not about us. You jump in.
So mine would be, the assumption is that the best learning happens in the classroom, and the assumption that that is where the education is, and if they're in there, they're learning, and therefore the by default the lack of acknowledgement of everything else, the lack of visibility of everything else, that adds to that whole. And I think, yeah, that's for me the assumption. Maybe that's why I want an AP, right? is about breadth and choice, and the pick and mix and all that. The assumption that it happens, that if it's there, you're learning and it's working, and that absolutely plays a part, but that actually they're naive and ignorant to the whole, and seeing the whole child. And Nici, to your point, your daughter has grown up and is going on to do amazing things as a beautiful human inside and out, no doubt, and thriving despite what she's been through. So imagine if we just make what she's been through 5% better of the ambition that we have, and if we acknowledge the learnings that she has that's not in the classroom. So yeah, that's ours, I guess. Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and I think conscious of everybody's time, and I'm conscious that we are. This is flying by. Like, we've done an hour and 17 minutes, and we could probably, as Steve would. What would you like to say, Steve? We could talk all night, but we're not going to talk all night because there's a certain little thing.
No, I couldn't talk all night. That was about 7 years ago, Steve. Literally, it's getting close to 9 o'clock, or edging close. I'm tired, man. So I can talk till 6 o'clock is the rule generally.
Oh, it used to be. It used to be you could talk all night. Now you're old, you can't. Yeah. So I think, interestingly, the last couple of points I think make a lot of sense of talking about the future. So we've talked about what inclusion might look like, or an education system that's inclusive in 2026. What could it look like, or what should it look like? We've talked about some of the barriers and some of the belonging, and I suppose we've got some hopes and we've got some things that keep us awake. But also tied into that is, if we had this conversation in 5 years' time, what would it look like? And what would we hope will have changed? So there's like this, what are our hopes that it is working? Where is it not? And then what would we hope to be happening? So I'm going to, that's a big question. It's a really big question. So I want to give people enough time to answer that question, which is why I wanted to do this. So can I come to you first, Patrick? And then I'm going to ask all of us that.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm going to give one word just to start it off. And unfortunately, it's not going to be something that's going to explain a lot, but I'm going to use the word individuality. So what I mean about individuality, we go back, Kate mentioned about the needs of individual children as well. And I suppose a small bit of insight, I've been recommended to put recommendations and conclusions in my research. And it's something that I've grappled with for a long time, because I have 7 people's narratives of education as students, becoming teachers and being teachers. And goes back to what Paddy says earlier about sometimes we can be too focused on putting people into boxes. So I hope in 5 years' time, we will have the time, number one, we'll have the space, and thirdly, we'll also have the ability to give the individuality of the students time in terms of what their needs are, and that we can have the time to develop that rapport and go from there. Nici mentioned a really, really important thing about pronunciation of names, incredibly important as well. But the fact that we have that time to focus on the individuality, and wouldn't it be really, really cool if we also had the resources? If we could identify within, just say, again, staying away from the specific students, but if we had 20 kids in front of us that we knew, we'd say what specific thing worked for Johnny or Mary. Apologies, my pseudonyms are never really inclusive, but that is not a case of, it's not a case of just for the top of the iceberg, like Paddy said, where we have that space, that time and the resources to support individuality, those individual learning preferences of all students. I think in 5 years' time, I would be very happy if we were back here having another conversation, and that was occurring.
Me?
Yeah, that's you, Nici. That's me not being able to find the unmute button quick enough. Sorry, go on.
We'll just let Paddy have the moment, so everyone just sit and reflect on that. on his powerful words. I use I use my fake child name as Gertrude, Patrick. So I think I win the ridiculous child's name. Sorry if anyone's called their child Gertrude, by the way.
It's really not inclusive, Nici, at all. There, what you've just done.
I just realised I've just had a brain fart moment.
Well, you've just called yourself Nici Foote, spelt Nici wrong, spelt Foote wrong. Like, come on, out yourself, not wrong, differently.
I'm so sorry. I've been here it's nearly an hour and 17 minutes. I've never sat so long in my life, people. This is a long time for me. Okay, what was the question? I personally, so in 5 years' time, what I would really love is I'd love that we were all a bit braver. I'm not going to do, I can't, there are so many things that we need to change that I get boggled in which one to pick. I can't pick. But I'm going to say we need the government to be a lot braver, and we need to have some consistency over time. Shopping and changing the people in charge of our systems is not something that I think our education is too valuable and too important. So for me, I need people to get braver and make hard decisions. And I want us as a group to be able to go over that tipping balance. Our wolf pack, our punks, our people who are pushing back on the boundaries, all the people who are here listening to this for an hour and now 20 minutes. These are the people that are investing in the future. Well, we need that tipping balance. We need more people in our pack.
Agreed. Paddy.
Okay. Maybe a contentious opinion, but I hope that in 5 years' time that nobody on this call phones me and says, Paddy, would you come on and sit on a podcast about inclusion? Because actually, and that's not about me retiring, my ideal world in 5 years' time is that inclusion is not a separate topic in and of itself that we have to debate and talk about and work through. And I do a thing in some of my talks where I talk a lot about accessible practice, and then I have a big strike through removing the word accessible practice, because it should all be accessible. It's just good practice. And actually, if you think about 5 years from now, are we going to have the same conversations? Unfortunately, yes, we are. But my ideal world is that we're not talking about inclusion as a thing. It's baked in and a natural expectation of what learning looks like. That in 5 years' time, we have genuinely moved to an approach, and Patrick talked about it at the outset, UDL, where we're focused on designing learning. And part of that is making sure that barriers are removed. And also, actually, Patrick, you touched upon how to recruit interest and build on interest in students, and that's all part of UDL. I hope technology has become invisible. We're not talking about it as a separate thing. It's there, and it's a natural extension of what we do and how we use it. And AI, I would like to assume, would be part of that. I think that's really important. I also think that, and I was thinking about this question, in 5 years' time, and this is again going to sound contentious, but bear with me. I hope we're not celebrating acts of inclusion, because I hope it's entirely expected that we don't have to isolate a particular bit of good practice and actually focus on it, that it's expected. And then I guess last thing is, for me, it comes back to what has slowly become my favorite word over the last year, which is, and you've all spoke about it so well, which is belonging. That any student walks into any school and says, yeah, this is me. I am that kid that left school early because I just did not like school. I didn't refuse school, but I hated every minute of being in school and secondary school. It was not built for me. It couldn't hold my interest in any way. And that's a different type of need, right? That nobody ever talked about back then, but I just didn't fit. And And so I hope every child 5 years from now can walk into a school and go, yep, this place was built for me. I'm good here and can move on. We have a long way to go to that. But yeah, let's hope, yeah, I don't have a job in 5 years. That would be good. Maybe it wouldn't be, but you know what I mean.
I'm just going to build on that, Paddy, and probably take it even one step further with my optimism. Is that plays into the pick and mix angle, really, but about agency. And so the child and the family and the community and the ecosystem that sit around the child have agency in how they, in how the child can learn in different ways. And we've touched on interest-based learning and project-based learning, and they have an awareness and an understanding of the different learning styles for others as well as for themselves, and that the community around them are supporting the child and encouraging the child to have agency. That is I guess maybe an operationalizing of inclusion. Is what does it mean on the ground to the child, is that the child has agency and choice. And I think we've talked about rebellious children, or children learning how to say no. That means the parent to two teenage girls, that's brilliant for me, them learning how to use their voice and in circumstances. So agency and education is sort of a natural next, it's almost a natural next step, and is the operationalizing of inclusion, or one of the ways, but it's probably much further than 5 years away. But my optimism will stay. Yeah, depends where you live as well a little bit, but that's a whole other conversation. So yeah, that's it for me.
It has been, I cannot believe we're almost at an hour and a half. Yeah. I think the judgment and the benchmark and the way that we judge these conversations, how accelerated. It's always an hour and a half, but actually how quickly that hour and a half ends and comes to it is always the testament to the people on the call.
And we're not going to mention who we thought was dragging it out, not in this call, on other webinars. We're not going to do that, obviously.
Absolutely not. I think what's been really, really great about this conversation is the hope, the aspirations, the excitement and the passion for what is coming, what has changed, and also what's to come, rather than everything that is wrong and needs changing. Actually, what's going well, yes, how we can be better, but ultimately the hopes and the ambitions of tomorrow, next week, next month, and then hopefully in 5 years as well. And that's what we have to hang on to, that actually there's a lot of doom and gloom, but there is so much positivity, there's so much expertise and so much excitement, I think, out there. And if we just base inclusion and it is, education should be for all, regardless, and actually the tailoring of all of those. I cannot believe, Ben, we are at the end of our roadshows, at the webinars. Thanks to Parent Pay Group for the support and the partnership. This is going to be tied into, now we've finished, me and Ben, the hard work actually starts. If you think about the report that was we talked about at all of the face-to-face roadshows, we will be collecting all the information, the database on that, and then pulling things together and putting out a report, and that links into the website, which is edufuturists.com/roadshow. So more information, and will follow and come out very, very soon. When I say very, very soon, years. If me and Ben do it based on acceleration, because we can't do it all.
Wow! Do not lump me into that, because I get things done fast, my friend.
You do, Ben. But a million things. So we'll step into the ones in an order. So we'll go through it, and ultimately, I cannot wait to share the findings of these conversations, the conversations that have happened face to face. And let's see where the end of 2026 and 2027 takes us, because I think there's more conversations to have. We're going to meet the community and the Wolfpack where we're at, and where you're at. So, and thanks to Parent Pay. Thanks also for anybody that signed in, but thanks to Patrick, Paddy, Kate, Nici, and you, Ben, as well, I guess,
thanks,
for the wonderful
too.
conversations and the chat today. But yeah, been a blast, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. So good.
Cheers.
Loved it.
Bye-bye.